The day was bright and warm as the Thompson family arrived at their new home in Maplewood Estates. It was a picturesque neighborhood, with neat rows of large, impressive houses, towering oaks that shaded the sidewalks, and perfectly manicured lawns. It was exactly the kind of place where Jamal and Tasha had dreamed of raising their children. Jamal, a successful real estate entrepreneur, looked over at his wife, Tasha, who was directing movers with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. Their two children, Kayla and Miles, were playing tag in the front yard, their laughter filling the air. To Jamal and Tasha, this new home was a symbol of all they had worked for. The long hours, sacrifices, and years of saving had finally paid off. Yet as they unloaded boxes and furniture, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Across the street, a tall, older man stood on his porch, arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the Thompsons with an intense, unblinking stare. "Do you see that guy?" Jamal muttered to Tasha, nodding toward the man. She glanced over and smiled faintly. "I see him." "Just give him a wave," she suggested, trying to keep things lighthearted. Jamal raised a hand in greeting, but the man didn't wave back. He simply stared, his expression unreadable. Jamal forced a smile, turning back to his family, but he couldn't ignore the unease growing in his chest. As they continued unpacking, he noticed the man had disappeared back into his house. "Let's just focus on getting settled," Tasha said, squeezing Jamal's hand. "This is our home now and nothing's going to spoil it." Jamal nodded, taking a deep breath. He hoped she was right. The next day, Jamal was organizing boxes in the garage when he saw the same man from across the street walking over, hands in his pockets and a critical look in his eyes. Jamal put down a box and greeted him warmly. "Hey there. I'm Jamal Thompson. We just moved in yesterday," he said, extending his hand. The man looked at his hand, hesitated, and finally shook it. "Charles Montgomery," he replied. His handshake was firm but brief, and his gaze remained intense. "So, where did you all come from?" The question felt like more than casual curiosity. Jamal kept his friendly tone, though he felt a bit on edge. "We were on the other side of town," he said with a smile. "Maplewood was always a dream of ours, and now we finally made it happen." Mr. Charles raised an eyebrow, giving Jamal a look that felt almost skeptical. "This area's pretty pricey," he said slowly, glancing back at the house as if questioning Jamal's ability to afford it. Jamal felt a flash of irritation but managed to keep his cool. "Yes, it is. My wife and I work hard, and we're thrilled to be here." Mr. Charles gave a curt nod, his face showing little friendliness. "Well, I hope you all enjoy it here," he said, but there was no warmth in his words. Without another word, he turned and walked back across the street. Tasha, who had been watching from the front steps, came over, shaking her head. "Did he really just question if we could afford to live here?" Jamal laughed it off. "He did, but it's fine. He'll warm up eventually. Not everyone likes change right away." Tasha sighed, looking back at the house across the street. "Maybe, but something tells me Mr. Charles won't be our biggest fan." In the weeks that followed, the Thompsons noticed a pattern of small but persistent incidents. Mr. Charles always seemed to find something to criticize. One day, Jamal parked his car slightly too close to the edge of his driveway, and Mr. Charles gave him a disapproving look, muttering under his breath. Another time, Kayla and Miles were playing in the front yard with a ball, laughing and having fun. Mr. Charles stepped out onto his porch, watching them with an annoyed expression. He muttered, "This isn't a playground," loud enough for Tasha to hear. Tasha tried to keep the peace, reminding her kids to play quietly. But it was hard to ignore the tension that seemed to radiate from across the street. The final straw came one weekend when the Thompsons hosted a small gathering to celebrate their new home. Family and friends came over, bringing food, drinks, and joyful energy. Kayla and Miles played in the backyard with their cousins, and the adults gathered on the porch, talking and laughing as the sun set. But across the street, Mr. Charles was pacing up and down his driveway, watching every move with an irritated scowl. The Thompsons tried to ignore him, focusing on their guests and the warm atmosphere they had created. The next morning, they found a note taped to their door. "Keep the noise down. This is a respectable neighborhood." Tasha sighed heavily, holding up the note for Jamal to see. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. Jamal frowned, but he didn't want to escalate things. "Let's just ignore it. He's probably just not used to having kids around. We'll give him time." A few weeks later, Jamal's brother and his family came to visit. The Thompsons were thrilled to catch up, and the kids were excited to play together. They played a game of basketball in the driveway, cheered each other on, and enjoyed the rare chance to be together. But once again, Mr. Charles was watching, his face growing darker by the minute. After a few minutes, he pulled out his phone, dialing a number while keeping his eyes locked on the Thompsons. 911, what's your emergency? Yes, I'd like to report some suspicious activity. There's a large group of people gathered in my neighbor's driveway, and they're making a lot of noise. I don't think they belong here, Mr. Charles said, his voice low and determined. A short while later, 2 police cars pulled up in front of the Thompsons' house, lights flashing. The family fell silent as the officers stepped out of their vehicles, one of them approaching Jamal. "Sir, we got a call about suspicious activity in the area," the officer said, glancing around at the gathering. Jamal's face fell, frustration etched in his expression. He forced himself to stay calm. "This is my house. We're just having a family gathering." The officer nodded, realizing the situation. "I understand, sir. We're just responding to a call. There doesn't seem to be any issue here." As the officers left, Jamal's shoulders sagged, and he looked over at Mr. Charles, who stood watching from his driveway. The family's joy had been dampened, and Jamal's heart ached at the realization that they were being treated as outsiders in their own home. The next week, word spread around the neighborhood about the police visit. Mrs. Sanchez, who lived next door, was talking with another neighbor, Mr. Harlan, about the incident. "It's such a shame. The Thompsons seem like such a lovely family," Mrs. Sanchez said, shaking her head. Mr. Harlan nodded in agreement. "Did you know Jamal didn't just buy that one house? I heard he actually owns multiple properties in the neighborhood. He's a real estate investor and has big plans for improving the area." Mrs. Sanchez raised her eyebrows, surprised. "Wow, I had no idea." Mr. Charles, who was nearby, overheard the conversation. His face turned pale as he realized his mistake. He had assumed the Thompsons were just another family moving in, but now he understood that Jamal was not only a neighbor but an important figure in the community. The weight of his prejudice hit him like a punch to the gut. Determined to make amends, Mr. Charles walked over to the Thompsons' house the next day and knocked on the door. Jamal opened the door, his expression cautious. Mr. Charles cleared his throat, struggling to find the right words. "I just wanted to apologize," he stammered, his voice thick with remorse. "I may have made some wrong assumptions about you and your family. I'm sorry." Jamal studied him for a moment, sensing the genuine regret in his eyes. He nodded, though he kept his response polite. "Thank you, Mr. Charles. We all just want to be good neighbors here." Mr. Charles left, feeling a weight lifted from his shoulders. He knew he still had a lot to learn, but this was a step toward change. Over the months that followed, the Thompsons became active in the neighborhood association, organizing events that brought the community together. They hosted neighborhood cookouts, game nights, and holiday gatherings, making Maplewood a warmer and more inclusive place. Mr. Charles, once distant, even began to join these gatherings, chatting with Jamal and Tasha and learning more about their lives. Though he and Jamal would never be close friends, they developed a mutual respect that bridged the gap between them. The Thompsons had done more than move into Maplewood Estates. They had brought a new spirit to the neighborhood. And through their resilience and kindness, they had changed not only Mr. Charles but the entire community for the better. The Thompsons' presence showed Maplewood that community isn't built on appearance or status, but on understanding, acceptance, and respect for one another.